Have you ever noticed that toxic people rarely leave you alone because you explained yourself well? They leave you alone when something in you shifts. That is the truth this episode is built on. Not that toxic people suddenly become respectful, not that they wake up one day with clarity, guilt, or self-awareness, but that they begin losing their hold on you the moment they feel that the old access is gone. The old reaction, the old guilt, the old opening they used to find so easily. Because in the end, toxic people do not stay powerful just because of what they do. They stay powerful because of what they can still reach inside you, and that is why this matters more than advice about clever comebacks or one last conversation. The real shift is deeper than words. It happens when your peace stops being negotiable, when your attention becomes harder to steal, when your silence stops meaning confusion and starts meaning control. When your boundaries stop sounding like temporary emotion and start feeling like a different standard. That is when the pattern begins to break, quietly but unmistakably. This is also why so many people stay stuck for too long. They think the answer is more explanation, more patience, more chances, more emotional effort. They think if they say it better, or softer, or more clearly, the other person will finally understand. But some people do not leave you alone when they understand you. They leave you alone when they can no longer use you in the same way. So this episode is about that shift, the one that changes the whole dynamic, the one that makes toxic people feel, maybe for the first time, that the version of you they used to reach so easily is no longer there. And once that becomes real, everything begins to change. Not only how they deal with you, but how you deal with yourself. If this speaks to something you have been carrying, subscribe and stay with me, because sometimes peace begins with one inner shift that other people cannot ignore. 1. Stop reacting immediately. The first shift is quieter than people expect, but it changes everything. Toxic people often stay powerful for one reason above all others. They know they can still reach you fast. They know they can say one thing, do one thing, send one message, use one cold tone, and something inside you will move immediately. You will feel the urge to answer, defend, explain, correct, or prove that they are wrong. And that is where the pattern keeps renewing itself. Not only in what they do, but in how quickly they can still pull you out of your center. This is why immediate reaction is so costly. It is not just an emotional moment. It is proof of access. Every fast reaction tells them that the old door is still open. It shows them that your attention is still easy to seize, and that your emotional state can still be influenced on command. For a toxic person, that matters more than agreement, affection, or peace. Sometimes all they really want is evidence that they can still disturb you. If they can still disturb you, they know they still have some power, and the damage rarely ends with the moment itself. One manipulative comment can sit in your head for hours. A short exchange can follow you into the rest of your day. You replay it, revise your words, imagine what you should have said, and carry the emotional charge long after the conversation is over. That is how toxic people take more from you than the interaction should ever have allowed. They do not just get a reaction, they get mental space, emotional energy, and time that should have belonged to your own life. The shift begins when you stop giving them that speed, not because nothing affects you, and not because silence is always the answer, but because your first responsibility is no longer to answer quickly. It is to protect your inner state. The moment you create even a small pause between what they do and what you allow into your mind, something changes. You stop being purely reactive. You begin choosing. You begin deciding whether this deserves a place inside you at all. That pause matters more than it seems. Toxic dynamics feed on urgency. They grow stronger when they can make you feel that everything must be answered now, emotionally, before your mind has had time to settle. But once you slow that process down, their usual tactics begin losing force. The same words do not land the same way. The same guilt does not pull you as deeply. The same provocation stops creating the same chain reaction. And that is where the title of this episode starts becoming real. Toxic people begin leaving you alone when they can no longer count on easy emotional access. The moment your reactions stop being available on demand, their confidence starts weakening. The old pattern begins to break. Not with noise, not with one dramatic speech, but with a quieter kind of power. They no longer reach you as easily as they used to. 2. Stop giving them easy access to you. The shift grows stronger the moment access to you stops feeling easy. This matters because toxic people do not stay in your life only through direct conflict. Very often they stay through availability. They stay because reaching you is still simple. A message still gets a reply. A small act of disrespect still gets your attention. A manipulative tone still gets you thinking. Even when the contact looks minor from the outside, the access can still be major on the inside. They may only take a few seconds of your day in real time, but they keep occupying your mind long after that. And as long as that remains true, the connection is still serving them. That is why this point is deeper than just talking less or creating some distance. A person can be physically farther from you and still have easy access to your inner world. You can stop seeing them often and still keep checking your phone because of them. You can speak less and still replay every exchange afterward. You can reduce contact outwardly while still leaving the emotional door wide open inwardly. And toxic people do not always need constant presence. Sometimes they only need enough access to keep influencing your peace. When access is easy, the pattern stays alive. They learn that they do not need much effort to get your energy. A message can pull you in. A vague remark can unsettle you. A little guilt can reopen something you had already tried to close. Over time, this creates a dynamic where they do not even need to do much. The habit of access does half the work for them. Your attention keeps meeting them before your standards do. That is why the shift here is so important. You begin making access harder, not in a performative way, not to create drama, not to punish, but to protect what has been too available for too long. You become slower to answer, slower to engage, less reachable through the same old emotional channels. You stop treating every message like an obligation. You stop letting every small interruption become a doorway into your mental space. And with that change, something very practical starts happening. Their influence begins shrinking because the pathway they relied on is no longer open in the same way. This also forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes access stays open because part of you is still hoping for something. A better explanation. A different ending, a sign of growth, a moment of honesty, a final conversation that brings closure. That hope is human, but it can also keep you exposed. It can make you available to situations you already understand well enough. And toxic people often benefit from that hope. They do not need to fully repair the relationship, they only need to keep the door from fully closing. So the shift is not only external, it is internal too. You stop measuring everything by whether contact is still possible and start measuring it by what contact is costing you. You start asking a better question, not, can I still reach them? But why am I still making it this easy for them to reach me? That question changes a lot, because once you see access as something valuable, you stop handing it out automatically. You become more protective of your time, your focus, your emotional rhythm, and your ability to have a normal day without someone else pulling on your mind. And this is where toxic people begin feeling the difference. They notice when your availability changes. They notice when getting to you is no longer quick, emotional, and predictable. They notice when the same moves no longer produce the same opening, and that is deeply frustrating for people who relied on ease. Their power weakens when access stops being simple. So this point is not about acting cold. It is about becoming less reachable in the exact places where they used to find you most easily. Because the shift that makes toxic people leave you alone is not just that you see them differently. It is that they begin experiencing you differently, harder to pull in, harder to interrupt, harder to use. And once that becomes real, the old pattern starts losing air. 3. Stop explaining yourself over and over. One of the clearest signs that a toxic pattern is still alive is that you keep feeling the need to explain yourself. On the surface, that can look healthy. You want to be fair. You want to be understood. You want to make your decision clear enough that the other person cannot twist it. But with toxic people, explanation often does not create clarity. It creates more room. More room for argument, guilt, distortion, and emotional pressure. The more you explain, the more material they have to work with. And before long, what should have been one simple decision turns into another exhausting conversation that keeps your mind trapped in the same place. That is why this point matters so much. Explaining over and over does not always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from discomfort. You feel the tension of not being understood, and you want to resolve it. You want to organize the situation so it feels cleaner, calmer, and more reasonable. But toxic people often do not use your explanations to understand you better. They use them to reopen what you were trying to close. They ask questions not to learn, but to keep you engaged. They challenge your reasons not because they are confused, but because they know that as long as you are still explaining, you are still emotionally available. And this is where so many people stay stuck for too long. They think if they can just say it better, shorter, softer, calmer, or more clearly, the other person will finally get it. But some people do understand. They simply do not like what your clarity means for them. They understand the boundary. They understand the distance. They understand the change. What they want is not more information. What they want is another opening. Another chance to move you back into doubt, guilt, or emotional labor. That is why repeated explanation becomes dangerous. It keeps you tied to decisions that should already be standing on their own. Instead of moving forward, you remain mentally attached to someone else's reaction. You start measuring the strength of your decision by whether the other person accepts it. And that is exactly what weakens the shift. Because the moment your piece still needs their approval to feel valid, the old dynamic is not fully broken yet. The healthier move is quieter and stronger. You say what needs to be said, and then you let it stand. You stop trying to rescue your decision from their discomfort. You stop trying to make every boundary sound acceptable enough to be received well. You stop feeling responsible for making the truth easy for someone who benefits from resisting it. And once you do that, something changes in you. Your words carry less panic. Your silence carries more certainty. You are no longer speaking to keep the connection alive. You are speaking, if needed at all, from a place that is already settled. This is part of the shift that makes toxic people leave you alone. They begin losing momentum when your decisions stop needing their approval. They begin losing access when your no is no longer the start of a long, emotional negotiation. They begin losing power when they realize your clarity is not something they can wear down through repetition. And that does not mean they will always stop immediately. Some will push harder for a while. Some will act confused. Some will behave as if your refusal to keep explaining is proof that you are unfair, cold, or difficult. But that reaction tells you something important. It tells you that the old pattern depended on your willingness to keep opening the conversation. Once that willingness fades, the whole dynamic starts weakening. So this point is not really about speaking less just for the sake of it. It is about ending the habit of turning your piece into something that must be defended again and again. Because once you stop explaining yourself over and over, toxic people begin facing a version of you that is much harder to pull back into the same cycle. 4. Set one. Firm boundary, and keep it. A lot of people think the shift happens when you finally say what you feel, but with toxic people, the real shift usually begins when you stop moving the line. That is what a boundary really is. Not a speech, not a threat, not a temporary emotional reaction. A line that stays where you put it. And that is exactly why this point matters so much. Toxic people often do not take your first reaction seriously. They have seen your frustration before. They have heard your limits before. They have watched you say, "enough," and then reopen the door later out of guilt, hope, pressure, or exhaustion. So the issue is rarely whether you can state a boundary. The issue is whether the boundary remains real after it gets tested. And it almost always gets tested. That is why a firm boundary changes the whole dynamic. It removes the confusion. It stops sending mixed signals. It tells the other person that access to you is no longer based on their mood, their pressure, or their ability to wear you down. It becomes based on a standard that does not keep shifting. That is what toxic people struggle with most. Not your anger, not your words, your consistency. Because when the line keeps moving, they learn something dangerous. They learn that your boundary is negotiable. They learn that enough guilt, enough persistence, enough emotional intensity, or enough waiting will eventually get them back in. They learn that your no might still mean convince me. And once they learn that, the old pattern stays alive. They stop respecting the line because the line does not really hold. This is why one firm boundary can do more than 10 emotional conversations. It changes how they experience you. It shows them that something structural has shifted. Maybe you no longer answer certain kinds of messages. Maybe you end the interaction the moment disrespect begins. Maybe you stop explaining once you have already been clear. Maybe you stop making yourself available after repeated manipulation. The exact form can vary, but the principle stays the same. The boundary must be simple enough to hold and strong enough to be felt. And this is where many people get uncomfortable, because a real boundary often creates tension at first. The other person may accuse you of changing. They may say you are being cold, selfish, harsh, dramatic, or unfair. They may act confused even when nothing is unclear. They may test the line in small ways, hoping the old version of you will come back. That part matters because it reveals something. Healthy people adjust to boundaries. Toxic people challenge them because they experience them as a loss of control. So, if the line creates discomfort, that does not automatically mean the line is wrong. Sometimes it simply means the line is finally real, and the deeper shift inside you is just as important. When you keep a boundary, you stop teaching yourself that your peace is optional. You stop behaving as if your emotional safety must always come second to someone else's comfort. You begin trusting your own judgment more because your actions are no longer betraying what you already know. That creates a quieter kind of strength. Not the strength of saying something powerful once, but the strength of remaining aligned after the moment passes. This is exactly what makes toxic people start leaving you alone. They leave you alone when the line stops moving. They leave you alone when access no longer depends on how hard they push. They leave you alone when they realize that the version of you they used to wear down is not responding the same way anymore. So this point is not just about saying no. It is about keeping no from becoming another conversation, because the moment a boundary stops being a sentence and starts becoming a pattern, the entire dynamic begins to change. 5. Stop rewarding their behavior with attention. One of the hardest truths to accept is that toxic behavior often survives because it keeps getting rewarded. Not always with love, not always with agreement. Sometimes it is rewarded with something much simpler: your attention, your reply, your emotional energy, your willingness to stay in the exchange long after it has already turned unhealthy. And that is why this point matters so much. Toxic people do not always need a positive response from you. Very often, any response is enough. If they can still pull you into the conversation, still occupy your mind, still make you defend yourself, still get you emotionally activated, then the behavior is still producing a result. That is what keeps the cycle alive. A lot of people think they are resisting toxic behavior while they are actually feeding it. They argue back. They explain more. They respond to every jab. They keep trying to set the record straight. From their side, it feels like self-defense. But from the other side, it often looks like access. It looks like proof that the method still works. The toxic person may not care whether the interaction is pleasant. They may care only that it continues. Because continuation means influence, and influence is often the reward they were seeking all along. This is why attention is so valuable. Wherever your attention goes, your energy follows. Your mood follows. Your thoughts follow. Your time follows. If a toxic person can repeatedly redirect those things toward themselves, they are still taking up space in your life, even when the relationship itself is already damaging you. And once that pattern becomes familiar, you may start participating in it without even noticing. You begin answering things that do not deserve answers. You begin mentally rehearsing responses to people who have not earned that level of access. You begin treating every act of manipulation like a challenge you must meet, instead of asking whether it deserves anything from you at all. The shift begins when you stop handing out attention so easily, not because you are trying to appear distant or superior, but because you are starting to understand what attention really is. It is not a small thing. It is not free. It is part of your life. And once you see that clearly, you stop offering it automatically to people who use it badly. You stop rewarding disrespect with long replies. You stop rewarding manipulation with emotional labor. You stop rewarding chaos with your full internal participation. That does not mean ignoring every difficult situation in life. It means learning to recognize when your engagement is no longer helping anything healthy grow. Some conversations are sincere and difficult. Those deserve care. But toxic patterns are different. They repeat without changing. They drain without resolving. They pull without building. And the longer you keep investing attention into those patterns, the longer they remain alive. This is also why withdrawal of attention can feel so powerful. It changes the emotional economics of the relationship. Suddenly, the old behavior no longer produces the same return. The jab gets less reaction. The guilt gets less movement. The manipulation gets less access. The pattern starts failing because the fuel is being reduced. And toxic people feel that. Even if they never admit it, they feel when they are no longer getting the same energy from you. That is often when frustration rises, when testing increases, or when they try one last round of pressure. But all of that usually points to the same truth. The reward is disappearing. And once the reward disappears, the behavior often weakens with it. That is why this point is directly tied to the title. Toxic people begin leaving you alone when their behavior stops paying off, when attention is no longer guaranteed, when emotional access is no longer automatic, when they can no longer count on you to keep giving life to the same cycle. That is the shift. Not convincing them to behave better, but refusing to keep financing the pattern with your focus. So this point is not about becoming cold, it is about becoming discerning. It is about learning that your attention is too valuable to keep spending on people who turn it into stress, confusion, and emotional exhaustion. And once that lesson becomes real, toxic behavior starts finding less and less to feed on. 6. Refuse to play their emotional game. Toxic people often stay in control because they know how to keep you inside the game they created. That game can look different from one person to another, but the structure is usually the same. They provoke, you react. They distort, you explain. They withdraw, you chase clarity, they create guilt, and you rush to repair what was never really yours to repair. After a while, it stops feeling like one conversation or one conflict. It becomes a pattern with its own rules, and those rules almost always favor the person creating the emotional confusion. That is why this point matters so much. The shift begins when you stop participating in the game itself. This is harder than it sounds, because emotional games often disguise themselves as normal human interaction. It may look like you are just trying to solve a problem. It may feel like you are being patient, fair, caring, or mature. But the deeper question is simple. Does this interaction lead anywhere healthy, or does it just keep pulling you into the same emotional loop? Toxic people often survive by keeping the loop alive. They do not need resolution, they need repetition. As long as they can keep you circling the same tension, they still have a place inside your mind. That is why refusing the game changes everything. You stop accepting every invitation into conflict, confusion, guilt, or emotional urgency. You stop feeling obligated to respond to every shift in their mood. You stop treating every manipulative move like a puzzle you must solve. And once that happens, something important begins to weaken. The cycle loses its rhythm. The person who depended on your participation starts running into a version of you that is not showing up in the same way anymore. This does not mean you become passive. It means you stop confusing participation with strength. A lot of people stay trapped because they think staying engaged proves dignity. They think if they leave the game, they are surrendering. But in toxic dynamics, constant participation is often the very thing that keeps you losing. You keep stepping into a structure that was designed to drain you. You keep offering sincerity to a pattern that feeds on instability. You keep showing up with good faith in situations that reward emotional confusion more than honesty. And the truth is, the game becomes much weaker when you stop playing your assigned role in it. That role might be the defender, the explainer, the peacemaker, the rescuer, the guilty one, or the emotionally available one who is always ready to reopen the conversation. Toxic people usually depend on one of those versions of you. They know how to activate it. They know how to make you step back into position. But when that role is no longer available on demand, they begin losing one of their main forms of control. This is also why refusing the game can feel strange at first. You may feel like you are leaving something unfinished. You may feel the old urge to clean it up, settle it, clarify it, fix it, or make sure the other person understands. But that discomfort is often part of the withdrawal from the pattern itself. You are no longer feeding the mechanism the way you used to, and your mind may still be adjusting to that silence. Stay with it, because what feels unfinished in the moment may actually be the first sign that the cycle is no longer being renewed. And that is exactly what the title is pointing toward. Toxic people begin leaving you alone when they realize they can no longer pull you into the old emotional structure. Their usual rhythm stops working. Their usual tension stops producing the same result. Their usual methods stop finding the same version of you. That does not always make them happy, but it does make them weaker, because when the game no longer works, their influence starts collapsing from the inside. So this point is not just about avoiding drama, it is about recognizing the game for what it is and refusing to keep supplying your energy to it, because once you stop playing, toxic people often lose much more than an argument. They lose the pattern that kept them connected to your peace. 7. Use silence instead of constant defense. One of the clearest signs that a toxic person still has access to you is that they can still make you feel that everything must be answered. Every accusation, every twisted version of events, every unfair tone, every attempt to make you look wrong, cold, selfish, or unreasonable. You feel the urge to step in and correct it before it settles. You want to defend your intention, your character, your side of the story. And on a human level, that urge makes sense. Nobody likes being misunderstood, and nobody enjoys watching someone distort the truth. But with toxic people, constant defense often becomes another form of attachment. The more you keep defending yourself, the more the pattern stays alive. That is why silence can become such a powerful shift. Not silence from fear, not silence because you have no answer, silence because you no longer believe every distortion deserves access to your energy. Toxic people often expect defense from you because defense keeps you engaged. It keeps you emotionally present. It keeps you working inside their frame. The moment you start defending yourself on their terms, they have already succeeded in pulling you into the space where they feel strongest. This is what makes constant defense so exhausting. It rarely ends with one explanation. You defend one point and another one appears. You clarify one misunderstanding, and then something else gets twisted. You answer one accusation, and suddenly you are explaining your tone, your timing, your motives, your memory, your entire character. What should have been a simple refusal turns into a long emotional labor that leaves you drained and strangely disconnected from your own original clarity. That is how toxic patterns grow. Not always through direct control, but through the endless pressure to keep proving yourself. Silence breaks that rhythm. It tells the other person and tells your own nervous system that not every attack deserves a courtroom. Not every distortion deserves a full response. Not every misunderstanding deserves your full internal participation. Some things are better met with distance than explanation. Some things become weaker the moment you stop feeding them words. And some people only keep pushing because they know you still feel responsible for answering. This does not mean silence is always the correct response in every difficult situation. Healthy relationships need communication. Honest misunderstandings deserve clarification. But toxic dynamics are different because the problem is not lack of information. The problem is misuse. They take your words and turn them into more confusion. They use your sincerity as material. They use your need to be fair as a way to keep you emotionally tied to the conversation. And once you see that clearly, silence stops looking passive. It starts looking disciplined. That discipline matters because silence creates a break in the old pattern. Instead of rushing to protect your image, you protect your peace. Instead of trying to correct every false version of you, you stop granting those versions the power to reorganize your day. You begin trusting that not every lie must be chased down, not every twisted interpretation must be dismantled, and not every person deserves unlimited access to your emotional energy just because they are willing to create noise. And that is often where toxic people begin feeling the change most clearly. They are used to movement, used to your defense, used to your effort, used to the sense that they can throw something into your mind and make you carry it. When that stops happening, they feel the loss of control. Their usual method no longer creates the same emotional opening. The old rhythm weakens. That is why this point is directly tied to the title. Toxic people begin leaving you alone when they can no longer keep you in a state of constant defense. When your silence becomes a boundary instead of a wound. When they realize they can still speak, but they can no longer make you follow every distortion into another exhausting exchange. So this point is not about disappearing. It is about refusing to keep proving your worth to people who benefit from your self-justification. Because once silence becomes stronger than your need to defend, the whole dynamic starts changing in your favor. 8. Stop feeling guilty for protecting your peace. One of the reasons toxic people keep finding a way back into your life is not always anger. Very often, it is guilt. Not guilt for something terrible you did, but guilt for becoming less available, guilt for pulling back, guilt for saying no, guilt for not answering the way you used to, guilt for choosing distance after giving too many chances. And that is what makes this point so important. A lot of people can see the manipulation, the disrespect, and the emotional cost clearly, but they still leave one door open because guilt makes self-protection feel cruel. Toxic people often know how to use that. Sometimes they do it directly. They remind you how much they need you, how much they are hurting, how different things used to be, or how disappointed they are by your change. Sometimes they do it more subtly. They act wounded the moment you become firm. They make your distance look cold. They make your boundary look unfair. They make your silence look like punishment. And if you are someone with a conscience, that can pull on you deeply. You begin questioning yourself. You wonder if you are being too harsh, too selfish, too difficult, too detached. And while you are busy re-evaluating your right to protect yourself, the old dynamic starts rebuilding. That is why guilt is so dangerous in toxic patterns. It reopens what your clarity had already closed. It makes you return, not because the situation became healthy, but because you feel bad staying away. It makes you confuse discomfort with wrongdoing. And once that happens, your peace becomes unstable again. You may still see the truth, but you stop living by it consistently because guilt keeps interrupting your judgment. The shift begins when you stop treating peace like something you need to apologize for. That matters more than it sounds, because as long as protecting your peace still feels morally suspicious to you, toxic people will always have a way back in. They do not need a wide-open door. They only need one small opening created by your self-doubt. One message that makes you feel bad. One moment where their discomfort starts mattering more than your stability. One situation where you abandon your own limit just to avoid feeling like the bad person. That is often all it takes to restart the cycle. But choosing peace is not cruelty. It is not betrayal. It is not selfishness. It is a form of self-respect. It is a decision to stop treating your inner life like public property that anyone can enter just because they are emotional enough, needy enough, dramatic enough, or disappointed enough. And once you really understand that, guilt begins losing some of its authority over you. You stop assuming that someone else's sadness automatically means you did something wrong. You stop believing that discomfort around your boundary proves the boundary is unfair. You stop confusing your kindness with endless emotional availability. And this is often where toxic people begin feeling the shift at a deeper level. They are not just losing your reaction, they are losing one of their strongest emotional tools. They can no longer count on guilt to reopen access. They can no longer rely on your good heart to override your better judgment. They can no longer pull you back simply by making you feel responsible for their feelings. That changes the whole dynamic, because once guilt stops moving you the same way, your peace becomes harder to negotiate. Your distance becomes more stable. Your boundary becomes less emotional and more real. And when toxic people feel that, they begin realizing that the version of you they used to influence through guilt is becoming unavailable. So this point is not small at all. It is one of the deepest parts of the shift. Toxic people begin leaving you alone when protecting your peace no longer feels like something you have to defend. The moment you stop feeling guilty for choosing what is healthy for you, one of their quietest forms of control starts disappearing. 9. Cut off the emotional access they depend on. A toxic person does not need to be around you all day to affect you. Very often they only need emotional access. That is what makes this point so important. Some people leave the conversation, but they do not leave your mind. They still shape your mood. They still interrupt your focus. They still take up space in your thoughts, long after the exchange is over. You may not be speaking to them much anymore, but part of you is still in contact with them internally. You keep replaying what happened. You keep anticipating what they might do next. You keep carrying their tone, their words, their pressure, or their version of events inside your day. And as long as that remains true, the connection is still alive in the place that matters most. That is what emotional access looks like. It is not only about whether they can reach your phone, it is about whether they can still reach your inner state, whether one small move from them can still rearrange your attention, whether they can still make you lose hours to overthinking, self-doubt, emotional tension, or the need to mentally respond to something that is already over. Toxic people often depend on that kind of access more than direct closeness. They do not always need to stay physically present. They only need to remain emotionally present enough to keep influencing your peace. And that is exactly why cutting off emotional access becomes part of the shift. You begin noticing that your inner life cannot stay open to everyone who knows how to disturb it. You begin recognizing that some people have survived in your world not because they are meaningful in a healthy way, but because they learned how to remain emotionally active inside you. They learned what creates mental replay. They learned what creates guilt. They learned what keeps you internally hooked even after the moment should have ended. Once you see that, the goal changes. You are no longer focused only on reducing contact. You are focused on reducing internal access. That requires a different kind of discipline. It means refusing to keep reopening the same emotional file in your mind. It means noticing when you are rehearsing another conversation that does not need to happen. It means catching the moments when their presence is no longer external, yet still continues inside you. And instead of following that familiar path again, you start redirecting your attention back to your own life. Not because it is easy, but because you finally understand the cost of leaving that inner door open. This is not about pretending you feel nothing. It is not about forcing yourself into emotional numbness. It is about becoming less available to internal occupation. You stop treating every memory, message, or manipulative moment like something that deserves repeated emotional processing. You stop giving toxic people the privilege of living in your mind rent-free. You stop allowing your peace to be organized around what they said, what they meant, what they might do, or whether they finally understand what they have done. And once that begins, something changes in a very practical way. They start losing their ability to follow you into the rest of your day. The moment ends more quickly. The emotional residue becomes lighter. The replay becomes weaker. They stop feeling as central. And that is a major part of why toxic people begin leaving you alone. Because once emotional access starts closing, the old pattern loses its depth. They may still speak, still test, still try, but they no longer land in the same place. They are meeting more distance inside you than before. That distance matters because toxic influence depends on staying emotionally alive within you. When that life support fades, so does much of their power. The words may still arrive, but they do not stay as long. The pressure may still appear, but it no longer reorganizes your mind the same way. The old entry point starts disappearing. So this point is not only about contact, it is about reclaiming your inner world from people who learned how to live there without permission. Because the shift that makes toxic people leave you alone becomes much more real when they can no longer find easy emotional access inside you. And once that happens, they begin fading not only from your conversations, but from your mental space too. 10. Stop trying to make them understand. One of the strongest shifts you can make is giving up the hope that the right explanation will finally change the dynamic. This matters because a lot of people stay emotionally tied to toxic patterns through one quiet belief. If I can just make them understand, maybe this will finally settle. Maybe they will see what they did. Maybe they will realize how unfair they were. Maybe they will understand the boundary, the distance, the pain, the exhaustion, the reason things had to change. And on a human level, that desire makes sense. Being understood feels like closure. It feels like order. It feels like justice. But with toxic people, the need to be understood often keeps you attached far longer than the situation deserves. That is because understanding is not always the problem. Some people understand perfectly well. They understand your boundary. They understand your exhaustion. They understand that they crossed the line. What they do not like is what your clarity costs them. It costs them access. It costs them control. It costs them the version of you that kept trying, explaining, softening, and staying available. So they resist, not because your point is unclear, but because your clarity threatens something they benefited from. And this is where people get trapped. They keep treating the situation like a communication problem when it is actually a pattern problem. They think one more calm conversation might change everything. One more honest message. One more attempt to say it with the perfect balance of firmness and kindness. But instead of closing the dynamic, it often extends it. You explain, they challenge, you clarify, they shift the focus, you restate, they misunderstand again. And before long, you are not moving toward peace. You are simply staying emotionally invested in someone else's refusal to meet you in good faith. That is why this point is so powerful. The shift begins when you stop measuring your peace by whether they understand you. You stop making your healing depend on their insight. You stop acting as if closure can only come after the other person finally sees the truth. Because sometimes they never will, and sometimes they will see it and still not respond in the way you hoped. If your stability depends on that moment, then your peace is still in their hands. Letting go of that hope does not mean you become bitter. It means you become clearer. You stop using your energy to force understanding where there is resistance, ego, manipulation, or emotional self-interest. You stop treating every refusal to understand as a challenge you must overcome. You stop giving endless emotional labor to people who have already shown you that access matters more to them than truth. And once you do that, something changes in a very practical way. You stop reopening old conversations just because they are still confused, offended, defensive, or unwilling to accept your position. You stop chasing the relief that you imagine understanding would give you. You start seeing that peace often comes not from being fully understood, but from no longer needing that understanding in order to move on. That is one of the deepest parts of the shift that makes toxic people leave you alone. They begin losing their hold on you when you are no longer trying to bring them to the same level of clarity you have already reached. They begin losing influence when your decisions stop waiting for their comprehension to feel complete. They begin fading when they realize you are not standing there, emotionally available, hoping one more explanation will finally make them respond differently. So this point is not really about them at all. It is about you releasing the need for their understanding to validate your experience. Because once that need begins to fall away, the old pattern starts losing one of its strongest emotional anchors. And toxic people often leave you alone when they can no longer keep you attached through the promise that maybe, one day, they will finally get it. 11. Detach from the need to correct every lie or distortion. One of the ways toxic people keep you emotionally tied to them is by pulling you into endless correction. They say something unfair, incomplete, twisted, or simply false, and immediately you feel the urge to set it straight. You want to correct the story, fix the framing, restore the truth, and make sure they do not walk away holding a version of events that feels dishonest. That impulse is deeply human. No one likes being misrepresented. No one enjoys watching someone twist reality in a way that makes them look worse, colder, weaker, or more guilty than they really are. But this is exactly why this point matters. With toxic people, the need to correct every distortion can become another leash. Because once they learn that a false version of events is enough to pull you back in, they no longer need truth to keep the connection alive. They only need distortion. They only need to throw something crooked into the space between you and wait for your nervous system to rush in after it. That is how the pattern keeps renewing itself. You're no longer just responding to reality. You're responding to every manipulated version of reality they create. And this is exhausting in a very specific way. You are not only dealing with what happened, you are now dealing with defending what happened from being reshaped. You clarify one thing and something else gets twisted. You correct one lie and a new angle appears. You try to restore fairness, and suddenly you are explaining your tone, your timing, your memory, your intention, and your character all over again. That is why this never really ends. Because the problem is not that the facts are unclear. The problem is that distortion itself has become part of the dynamic. The shift begins when you stop treating every lie like a battle that must be won. That does not mean truth stops mattering to you. It means you stop giving every false version of you unlimited access to your energy. You begin recognizing that some distortions are not invitations to clarify. They are bait. They are a way of keeping you emotionally involved, morally defensive, and mentally busy. And once you see that clearly, detachment starts becoming possible. You stop feeling responsible for chasing every crooked narrative until it finally stands straight. You stop acting as if your peace must wait until every false impression has been corrected. This is difficult because part of you may still feel that silence allows the lie to win. But in toxic dynamics, chasing every lie often gives the distortion more life than it ever would have had on its own. You end up investing hours, days, sometimes even months, trying to fix the version of you that exists inside someone else's mind. And the harder you chase it, the more your peace becomes dependent on controlling their narrative. That is exactly what keeps you trapped. Real detachment sounds quieter. You know what is true. You know what happened. You know where you stood. And you stop needing every person, especially a toxic one, to reflect that truth back to you correctly before you can move on. That is a serious shift in strength. Because once you stop chasing control over their version of events, they lose one of the easiest ways to keep pulling you into the same emotional loop. And this is directly connected to the title. Toxic people begin leaving you alone when distortion stops buying them access, when lies no longer guarantee your return, when they can no longer keep you emotionally occupied by forcing you into endless correction. The pattern weakens because one of its old tools stops producing the same result. So this point is not about giving up on truth. It is about refusing to keep sacrificing your peace at the altar of someone else's false narrative. Because once you detach from the need to correct every lie or distortion, toxic people begin losing one more way to stay alive inside your mind. 12. Protect your time like it has value. One of the clearest signs that the shift is becoming real is that you stop treating your time like something toxic people can keep taking from you. This matters because time is not only hours on a clock. It is your attention, your mental space, your emotional rhythm, your ability to move through a normal day without being constantly interrupted from the inside. And yet this is exactly what toxic people often consume. They do not only take moments, they take mornings through overthinking. They take evenings through mental replay. They take focus through stress, hesitation, and emotional residue. Sometimes the interaction itself is brief, but the cost keeps spreading long after it ends. That is why protecting your time matters so much. It forces you to see the full price of what you have been allowing. A lot of people notice disrespect before they notice theft of time. They notice the lie, the manipulation, the guilt, the pressure, the strange tension. But they do not always stop and ask a more powerful question. How much of my life is this taking from me? Not just how much of my peace, but how much of my actual day? How many hours have gone into explaining, defending, replaying, anticipating, recovering, or mentally carrying something that should never have had this much access to me in the first place? That question changes the whole frame. Because once you start seeing toxic patterns as a drain on the substance of your life, not just a difficult emotional issue, it becomes harder to keep treating them lightly. And that is where the shift begins. You stop behaving as if your time is endlessly available to every person who creates noise. You stop giving your best mental hours to people who repeatedly turn them into confusion. You stop letting every interruption, message, pressure tactic, or emotional game take priority over your work, your rest, your health, your family, your prayer, your plans, or your actual future. You begin treating your time like something that belongs to your life again, not to the cycle. This is deeper than scheduling. It is about value. Because the way you protect your time reflects how seriously you take your own existence. If someone can keep stealing your attention and scattering your focus, they are not just affecting your mood, they are shaping the texture of your days. And days become weeks, weeks become months. That is why this point matters so much. Toxic people often stay present because they are still being funded with pieces of your life. Pieces that feel small in the moment but become heavy over time. Once you see that clearly, something begins to tighten in a healthy way. You become more selective. You stop answering from reflex. You stop giving long emotional energy to the same exhausting loops. You stop treating every interruption as if it deserves immediate entry into your day. You begin choosing your attention with more intention. And with that shift, toxic people begin losing something crucial, your availability at the level of time. That changes everything because time is one of the most concrete forms of access. If they can no longer keep you thinking, replying, spiraling, rehearsing, or emotionally reorganizing your day around them, then their influence weakens in a very practical way. They are no longer just being resisted. They are being deprioritized. They are no longer occupying the center. And toxic people feel that. They feel when they stop getting your hours, your energy, and the subtle sense that your life still bends around their presence. That is why this point connects so directly to the title. Toxic people begin leaving you alone when your time starts feeling expensive to misuse. When access to your day is no longer easy, when your focus is no longer theirs to scatter, when your emotional noise stops being funded with actual hours of your life. That is a major part of the shift. So this point is not simply about productivity, it is about dignity. It is about realizing that peace is not only a feeling, it is also a way of protecting the time you still have left to live your own life. And once you begin guarding that seriously, toxic people start finding less and less room to remain important. 13. Become less available to chaos. There is a moment in every toxic dynamic where you realize the problem is no longer only the person. It is the atmosphere they keep pulling you into. That atmosphere is chaos. Not always loud chaos, but emotional chaos, uncertainty, tension, sudden shifts, mixed signals, small dramas that become bigger than they should. A constant feeling that your peace can be interrupted at any moment. And this is exactly why this point matters. Toxic people often stay influential because they do not only bring problems, they keep you available to disorder. They keep you emotionally reachable through instability. The shift begins when you stop living like chaos deserves easy access to you. That sounds simple, but it changes more than people expect. A lot of the time, the real pattern is not just that someone is difficult, it is that you have become too available to the emotional weather they create. Their mood changes and your nervous system reacts. Their silence changes and your mind starts searching for meaning. Their pressure rises and suddenly your whole day begins organizing itself around something that should never have had that much power. That is what it means to be available to chaos. It means your inner state is still too responsive to disorder coming from outside you. And toxic people can feel that availability. They feel when your balance is easy to shake. They feel when confusion can pull you in faster than clarity can ground you. They feel when a little tension is enough to make you reopen a conversation, abandon a boundary, or start emotionally working far harder than the situation deserves. They may not describe it this way, but they sense it. They sense where instability still has access. That is why becoming less available to chaos is such an important shift. You begin valuing steadiness more than urgency. You stop assuming that every emotional disturbance must be followed, analyzed, or fixed immediately. You stop making your mind so easy to recruit into every wave of tension that someone else creates. And once that starts happening, the whole dynamic changes. Not because life becomes perfectly calm, but because chaos is no longer getting the same welcome inside you. This is also where calm becomes more than a personality trait. It becomes protection, not fake calm, not passive calm, real calm, the kind that comes from refusing to let every unstable moment become your personal responsibility. The kind that makes you slower to absorb, slower to personalize, slower to react. That kind of calm frustrates toxic people because chaos works best when it finds open ground. When it meets someone who will carry it, spread it, or reorganize their day around it. But when it meets a calmer, firmer version of you, it starts losing momentum. And this is what people often misunderstand. Becoming less available to chaos does not mean you stop caring about anything. It means you become more selective about what deserves entry into your emotional world. You stop granting full access to every storm. You stop treating confusion like intimacy. You stop mistaking intensity for importance. And that changes the quality of your life in a very deep way. Because so much suffering comes not only from what chaotic people do, but from how completely you let their instability occupy your mind. Once that shift becomes real, toxic people begin feeling it almost immediately. Their unpredictability stops working as well. Their emotional swings stop getting the same response. Their pressure stops finding the same opening. The old methods begin landing on someone who is less available to disorder, and that makes the whole pattern weaker. They can still bring chaos, but they can no longer assume you will host it. That is why this point belongs so clearly under the title. Toxic people begin leaving you alone when chaos stops getting easy access to your inner life, when your calm becomes harder to break, when your stability stops bending around their instability. And once that happens, something changes at the root. They are no longer dealing with someone they can keep pulling into emotional weather. They are dealing with someone whose peace has become harder to interrupt. So this point is not small at all. It is one of the clearest signs that the shift is becoming permanent, because the calmer and firmer you become, the less room chaos finds to operate. And when chaos finds less room, toxic people start losing one of the main conditions that kept them close to you. 14. Stay consistent, long enough to change the pattern. A lot of people can be strong for a day. The real shift begins when your strength stops looking temporary. This matters because toxic people often do not react to one boundary, one quiet response, or one moment of distance as if everything has changed. They have usually seen emotion before. They have seen frustration before. They have seen moments where you pulled away, became firm, or said you were done. What they are often waiting to see is whether this change will last, whether your silence holds, whether your boundary survives pressure, whether your new standard is real or just another emotional moment that will soften with time. That is why consistency matters so much. It turns a decision into a pattern, and patterns are what toxic people understand best. If your reaction changes for 1 week and then returns, they learn that all they need is patience. If your boundary becomes clear for a few days and then moves again, they learn that enough pressure will reopen the door. If your peace matters only when you are strong, but disappears when you feel guilty, lonely, tired, or emotionally vulnerable, they learn that your shift is not stable yet. And once they learn that, the old dynamic remains alive under the surface. It may pause for a while, but it does not really end. That is why temporary strength is not enough. The pattern changes only when your behavior begins teaching a new reality. You do not just react differently once. You keep reacting differently. You do not just hold the line when it is easy. You hold it when it is uncomfortable. You do not just protect your peace when you feel powerful. You keep protecting it even when old emotions rise and try to pull you backward. That repetition matters because it slowly removes the other person's confidence in the old version of you. And this is where a deeper kind of strength begins to form. Not the dramatic strength of one final moment, but the quieter strength of non-return. The strength of not reopening what you already closed. The strength of not undoing your own clarity because someone knows how to create emotional pressure. The strength of staying aligned with what you know, long enough for your own nervous system to trust the change, and for the other person to feel it too. Consistency also changes something inside you. It stops the inner conflict between what you understand and how you behave. A lot of suffering comes from that gap. You know the pattern is unhealthy, but you keep slipping back into it. You know the boundary is right, but you keep violating it yourself. You know the access is damaging, but you keep granting it again. That internal split drains your self-trust. But once your actions begin matching your clarity consistently, something steadier starts growing. You begin trusting yourself more because you are no longer abandoning your own truth in the moments that matter most. And toxic people feel that shift. They feel when the old rhythm stops returning. They feel when the same guilt, the same pressure, the same provocation no longer gets them back to the same version of you. They may test it for a while. They may push harder in the beginning. They may wait for a moment of weakness. But over time, if the consistency holds, the message becomes unavoidable. The old pattern is not coming back. That is when change becomes real. This is exactly why this point belongs so directly under the title. Toxic people begin leaving you alone when they stop expecting access to return. They leave you alone when your new way of responding no longer looks like a phase. They leave you alone when your standard becomes stable enough that trying the old methods starts feeling pointless. That is what consistency does. It changes their expectations, and once expectations change, behavior often changes with them. So this point is not only about discipline, it is about permanence. It is about staying with the shift long enough that it becomes part of who you are, not just something you did in one strong moment. Because once your peace becomes consistent, toxic people begin realizing they are no longer dealing with the same pattern. And when the pattern changes, their place in your life often starts disappearing with it. 15. Let your new standards speak louder than words. In the end, the deepest shift is not what you say. It is what your life starts making clear without needing to say much at all. That is why this final point matters so much. Toxic people often survive through conversation, through explanation, through reaction, through the constant sense that they can still pull words out of you, still pull effort out of you, still keep you emotionally engaged enough to remain relevant. But once your standards truly change, something more powerful begins to happen. Your behavior starts delivering the message before your mouth does. And that kind of message is much harder to argue with. Because people can debate words, they can twist them, resist them, question them, act confused by them, or pretend not to understand them. But change standards are different. They are visible. They show up in what you no longer answer, what you no longer tolerate, what you no longer explain, and what you no longer make room for. They show up in the calmness of your responses, in the steadiness of your boundaries, in the way your time stops bending around someone else's instability. And once that change becomes visible, the entire dynamic begins to feel different to the other person. That is what toxic people notice most. Not the speech, the structure. They notice that your energy is harder to provoke, They notice that guilt is not reopening the same doors. They notice that one emotional move no longer buys the same level of access. They notice that your peace is no longer something they can interrupt as easily as before. And this is exactly why new standards matter more than old arguments. Arguments still keep you in motion around them. Standards make them experience a different version of you altogether. This is also where a lot of people finally stop feeling exhausted, because once your standards begin doing the talking, you no longer feel the same pressure to constantly explain your growth. You stop trying to convince difficult people that your peace matters. You stop making every change sound acceptable enough to be respected. You stop presenting your self-protection like a case that must be approved before it becomes valid. That burden starts falling away, and with it comes a different kind of freedom. The freedom of not having to narrate every shift in order for the shift to be real. And this is often the point where toxic people begin leaving you alone in a more lasting way. Not because they suddenly become better, but because they begin reading the situation differently. They feel that the old access is gone. They feel that the familiar openings are smaller or closed. They feel that your standards now cost them more than they used to. And toxic people usually stay where access is easy. When access becomes difficult, unstable, or unprofitable for them, their grip weakens. That is why this final point gathers everything that came before it. The silence, the boundary, the consistency, the reduced access, the refusal to explain, the protection of your time, the release of guilt, the withdrawal from chaos. All of it becomes visible in one larger truth. You are no longer living by the old standard. And once that is felt clearly enough, words become less important because the message is already there in how you move. So this is the final shift beneath the title. Toxic people leave you alone when your new standards make it unmistakable that the old version of you is no longer available. Not louder, not crueler, not more dramatic, just clearer, more settled, harder to misuse. And once that becomes real, many of the people who used to disturb your peace so easily begin finding less and less to work with. That is what changed standards do. They say, without needing many words, that the old access is over. And for toxic people, that is often the moment the pattern finally starts ending for good. And maybe that is the deeper truth beneath all of this. Toxic people do not leave you alone because you finally found the perfect words. They leave you alone when the old access disappears. When your reactions stop being available on demand. When your boundaries stop moving. When your guilt stops reopening doors that should have stayed closed. When your time, your energy, and your inner world stop feeling easy to enter. That is the shift. Quiet on the outside, but life-changing on the inside. What makes this powerful is that it is not only about them, it is about what begins returning to you once the pattern starts breaking. Your attention returns, your clarity returns, your sense of self returns. You stop spending so much of your life emotionally orbiting someone else's chaos. You stop treating every disturbance like a call to respond. You stop building your days around what someone else might say, do, or feel next. And in that space, something steadier begins to grow, a kind of peace that is not based on controlling people, but on no longer being so easily controlled by them. That is why this kind of change matters so much. It is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is not about winning one final moment. It is about becoming someone whose standards now protect what used to stay exposed. And once that becomes real, toxic people often begin fading in the most revealing way possible, not because you chased them away, but because they can no longer find the same opening in you. So if there is one thing to carry from this episode, let it be this. The shift that makes toxic people leave you alone is not forcing them to change. It is becoming less available to what kept them powerful in your life. And once you do that, your peace stops being something they can keep borrowing from you. If this episode spoke to something real in your life, subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who may need this today.